I step outside at dawn and my boat's gone. 11 years in my driveway. A 32 feet decommissioned U.S. Navy patrol vessel. Battle-card fiberglass faded gray hull from real service. Now tire gouges in the concrete. A deep scrape. Dead grass rectangle where it sat. Aaron had stormed my porch. That eyesore kills property values. Remove it, or else. I nodded politely. Closed the door. She raged. Called a tow truck overnight. Hauled it off my property like trash. What she ignored. It's not just a boat, it's federal military property. Still under Navy oversight for history and training. The Navy doesn't ask nicely when their asset vanishes. They send agents who knock once hard, watch what happens when the uniforms arrive. Ever had a petty power trip? Steal what's yours. Drop your branch or state below. Navy vets, sound off. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but my history does. I'm a retired Navy petty officer. 22 years, 2 deployments, 1 bad knee, and a pension that lets me sleep at night. After I hung up the uniform, I settled in Crestwood Pines, a quiet subdivision outside Roanoke, Virginia, the kind of place with good neighbors, decent schools, and roads smooth enough that you don't have to realign your truck every 6 months. The boat was a 1987 Bertram 31 Sport Fisherman. To most people, it looked like an aging blue and white workhorse with a faded stripe and a diesel engine that smelled like 40 years of honest use. That rich, oily mechanical perfume that real fishermen recognize the way chefs recognize a good stock. To me, it was the thing I'd rebuilt from a stripped hull over 3 winters. Every weld, every line of call, every foot of new electrical wire, I'd put it there. The boat had also done 1 tour of duty of its own. It was registered as a documented vessel with the U.S. Coast Guard under a historical maritime preservation classification because the hull had verifiable service records going back to a Navy auxiliary contract in the late 1980s. That classification mattered more than I knew at the time. I'd kept the Bertram on a concrete pad beside my driveway since I moved in. 11 years. The HOA's original CC and RS. The covenant's conditions and restrictions allowed recreational vehicle and watercraft storage on private driveways or adjacent pads as long as the unit was screened on 2 sides. I had a cedar privacy fence on 2 sides. I had the paperwork. I had photographs dated every year since 2013. The crunch of that gravel driveway under the boat trailer wheels was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Then Darlene Whitlock moved in. Darlene was one of those people who treat a subdivision HOA like a small principality they have personally inherited. She was maybe 62, retired from some kind of mid-level county assessor's position, and she arrived in Crestwood Pines with the energy of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a kingdom. She ran for HOA board president 8 months after she moved in, won by 6 votes, mostly people who didn't show up to vote, and immediately began reinterpreting every rule in the CC and RS as though she were the Supreme Court. She didn't like my vote from day one, the first time she knocked on my door, and I remember this clearly because I'd just come in from mowing and my shirt smelled like cut grass and motor oil and sunscreen. She stood on my porch, clipboard in hand, and told me the boat was aesthetically disruptive to community property values. Not a rule violation, not a formal notice, just her opinion delivered with the certainty of a pharaoh addressing a servant. I thanked her politely, explained the CCNR provision, showed her the cedar, screening, and closed the door. 3 weeks later, she sent me a formal HOA notice claiming the boat exceeded the storage footprint guidelines, a clause she had apparently written into an amendment at a board meeting that only 4 people attended. The amendment had been passed 3-1. The one to send her was my neighbor Clint Barrow, a retired electrician who smelled the rat immediately. The notice gave me 30 days to remediate or remove. I wrote back certified mail, citing the original CCNRs, the grandfather provision protecting improvements made before any amendment's adoption, and the Virginia Property Owners Association Act Section 551-1820, which limits an HOA's authority to modify previously approved uses without a supermajority vote. Darlene did not respond to my letter. She sent a towing company instead. The morning I found the empty patch of dead grass. The air smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet, that electric iron-tinged promise of a thunderstorm hanging over the Blue Ridge foothills. I stood in my driveway in a t-shirt and Old Navy sweatpants, coffee mug in hand, and I did what any sane person does in that moment. I assumed I was wrong. I walked the entire property, checked behind the garage, checked the side gate, walked around a clinched driveway next door, because sometimes we moved things when one of us had a delivery truck coming. No boat. I called the Roanoke County non-emergency line. They told me no vehicles matching my description had been impounded by law enforcement. That meant a private tow. I called 3 local towing companies before I found the one, Ridgeline Recovery, out on Route 220. The dispatcher paused just slightly too long before she said, "We may have a unit matching that description. We may have a unit matching that description." It was contracted through a private property management request. Who authorized it? I asked. Another pause. The Crestwood Pines Homeowners Association. Now here's what most people do in that moment. They go to the HOA and they yell. They threaten, they post on Facebook. And Darlene was counting on that, because if I went to her door hot and loud, I became the problem. I became the aggressive veteran with anger issues. She'd already mentioned my combative communication style in an email to 3 other board members. I found that out later. I did not go to Darlene's door. I went inside, made a second cup of coffee, and started documenting everything. I photographed the empty pad. I photographed the tire tracks from the tow truck. Wide commercial raid tracks that had chewed the edge of my concrete pad and left a scrape in the slab. I timestamped every image with a metadata locking app. I called Ridgeline Recovery back and asked them to email me written confirmation of the request, the authorizing party's name, and the storage location of my vessel. Under Virginia Code, Section 462-1217, a towing company that removes a vehicle from private property is required to notify both the local law enforcement agency and the vehicle's registered owner within 30 minutes of the tow. They had done neither. Takeaway. If a private tow happens without proper notification, it may constitute wrongful towing under state law, and the towing company can be liable for storage fees plus a penalty. I had them, but I didn't move yet. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the HOA on official letterhead, Darlene's signature large and flourishing at the bottom. It announced that the association had acted in the interest of community safety and appearance standards to remove an unauthorized structure from my property, and that any retrieval of said property would require my formal acknowledgement of violation and payment of a $275 community remediation fee before the unit would be released. Let me translate that into plain English. She wanted me to add me. I was wrong and pay a fine before I could get my own boat back. There's something clarifying about that level of arrogance. It's almost a gift because it tells you exactly who you're dealing with and exactly how far they're willing to go. Darlene wasn't just enforcing rules. She didn't actually have the legal authority to do what she'd done. And somewhere under that confident signature, she knew it. This wasn't about the boat anymore. This was about making me kneel. I didn't kneel. I called Clint Barrow and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a second, the particular quiet of a man calculating something, and then he said, "You know she didn't have a board vote on the tow, right?" I would have known. That was the first crack in her wall. In the Virginia Property Owners Association Act, unilateral enforcement actions taken by a single officer without board authorization aren't just irregular. They can expose the individual officer to personal liability, separate from the association. Darlene had apparently hired Ridgeline Recovery on her own authority as president without a vote. I started a legal file, manila folder, blue pen, everything in chronological order. I wrote evidence on the tab in block letters. Then I made a phone call that Darlene would not have expected in 1,000 years. I called the U.S. Coast Guard Vessel Documentation Center in Falling Waters, West Virginia, and I told them my federally documented vessel had been removed from my property by a private party without my consent. The woman on the phone got very still. "Sir," she said, "can I get your documentation number? Here's something most people don't know about federal vessel documentation." And I say this as someone who didn't fully appreciate it himself until a Coast Guard program specialist explained it to me in a tone usually reserved for people who have touched something they shouldn't have. When a vessel is documented with the U.S. Coast Guard under Title 46 of the U.S. Code, it isn't just registered. It is recognized as a preferred ship's mortgage asset under federal maritime law. More importantly, A documented vessel's status as U.S. property falls under federal jurisdiction in a way that overlaps significantly with Admiralty law. You cannot seize, tow, or impound a documented vessel through a purely civil HOA process, the same way you might tow a car. There are notification requirements, there are federal agency interests, and in my case, because the Bertram carried historical auxiliary service records from a 1988 Navy logistics contract, records I had found in the National Archives during restoration, the vessel had a thin but real thread connecting it to Navy historical property interests. Takeaway: if your boat is U.S. Coast Guard documented, an HOA towing it without court order or law enforcement involvement may be interfering with federally recognized property, which is a different legal problem entirely. I explained this to a maritime attorney named Prescott Galloway, who practices out of Norfolk and who I found through the Virginia State Bar's referral directory. Prescott listened to the whole story in about 12 minutes and then said with the pleasurable calm of a man who sees a clear path, "They walked into this. I'll have a demand letter out by Friday." Meanwhile, Darlene was not idle. She posted on the Crestwood Pines neighborhood app, one of those platforms that functions as a community bulletin board and is in practice a theater for small grievances, a notice titled Community Safety Update. She did not mention me by name, but the language was surgical. She referred to an unregistered watercraft stored in violation of community standards and multiple neighbor complaints about safety and aesthetics. She included a photograph of my pad taken from the E Street. The comments filled up fast. Some neighbors sided with her, the ones who'd always been uneasy about the boat, who thought it made the neighborhood look working ass, a phrase that tells you everything you need to know about where certain anxieties live. Others pushed back. Clint posted a 3-paragraph comment citing the original CC and RS, the grandfather clause, and the supermajority amendment requirement, all verbatim. He clearly had his own copy of the documents. What Darlene didn't know was that while she was performing outrage online, Clint had been walking the cul-de-sac with a yellow legal pad for 2 days. Not for me, for himself. He'd watched Darlene pull similar moves on 2 other neighbors, a woman named B. Strom, who'd been ordered to remove a therapeutic hot tub that predated Darlene's amendment, and an older widower named Gerald Foss, who'd received 3 notices about a hand-painted mailbox that had stood for 15 years. Clint was collecting signatures for a petition to call a special HOA meeting to review Darlene's conduct as president. He had 14 signatures before he told me about it. I meanwhile filed 3 formal complaints simultaneously. First, a wrongful towing complaint with the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles Consumer Protection Unit against Ridgeline Recovery, citing the Section 462-1217 notification failure. Second, a complaint to the Virginia Common Interest Community Ombudsman. Yes, that's a real office, citing the HOA's failure to follow its own amendment adoption procedures. Third, I called the Navy's Judge Advocate General's office in Washington and explained the historical documentation situation. They were, to put it mildly, intrigued. The JA paralegal I spoke to, a young woman who had the brisk efficiency of someone who handles 17 problems before lunch, asked me to email the vessel's historical records, the Coast Guard, documentation number, and a summary of the tow circumstances. I sent everything that afternoon. 3 days later, I got a call from a JAG lieutenant commander who told me that while the vessel's Navy connection was attenuated, her word attenuated, which I appreciated. The historical records were sufficient to warrant an inquiry, and that 2 officers would be making a courtesy visit to the towing facility and to the HOA president to clarify the status of the asset. She used the word asset. I said that sounded completely reasonable. Then I called Prescott and told him the Navy was coming. He laughed for about 4 seconds straight, which for a maritime attorney is the equivalent of a standing ovation. Darlene found out about the complaints the way arrogant people always find out bad news. Too slowly and all at once. The Virginia Ombudsman's office sent a formal inquiry notice to the HOA's registered agent, which was Darlene herself, within 5 business days of my complaint. The DMV Consumer Protection Unit sent a separate notice to Ridgeline Recovery, and whatever the JAG office communicated to Ridgeline Recovery's owner about the potential federal dimension of the asset they were storing. It was apparently enough to make him call Darlene directly and use words that are not suitable for a family-friendly YouTube channel. She called me on a Wednesday evening. I was grilling on the back deck pork chops, a little garlic, the smoke rising slow and sweet in the September air when my phone buzzed with her number. I let it ring twice, thought about the call. Recording app I downloaded the night before and picked up. Virginia is a one-party consent state for call recording. That means as long as one party to the call consents to the recording, it's legal. I was the one party. I consented. I hit record. Takeaway. In one party. Consent states. You can legally record any phone call you're a participant in. Always verify your state's law first. But in Virginia, this is straightforward. Darlene's opening move was warmth. The particular warmth of someone who has just discovered they are standing on thin ice and would very much like to back up. I think there's been some miscommunication, she said, and I'd really like to see if we can resolve this neighborly without involving outside parties. Outside parties like the Navy. I asked a pause, the particular pause of someone recalibrating. She offered me a deal. She would have the boat returned to my property at the HOA's expense. She would waive the $275 remediation fee, and she would revisit the amendment language at the next regular board meeting. In exchange, she wanted me to withdraw the complaints. I told her I appreciated the call and that I'd think about it. I did not think about it for very long. The complaints stayed, filed. The recordings went to Prescott. Here's why I didn't take the deal, and this is important. When someone who has wronged you offers a settlement that returns you to exactly where you were before they wronged you, they're not making you whole. They're making themselves safe. Darlene wanted the complaints gone because the complaints were a threat to her personally. The Virginia POA Act allows for personal liability for board officers who act outside their authority. She wasn't worried about the HOA. She was worried about her own retirement account. Darlene then tried to solve her towing company problem by calling Ridgeline Recovery and asking them to just bring the boat back quietly. The owner of Ridgeline, a man named Dale, who, based on our phone call, had the wary pragmatism of someone who has been burned by bad clients before, refused. Once the DMV complaint was filed, returning the vessel without documentation could be interpreted as evidence, tampering in a regulatory proceeding. His attorney had told him not to touch it until the complaint was resolved. The boat sat in Ridgeline's yard, acre-wing storage fees at Ridgeline's cost because their improper notification liability meant those fees were now their problem, not mine. By Thursday, Clint had 21 signatures on his petition. The Crestwood Pines HOA bylaws required 20 signatures to compel a special board meeting. He filed the petition with the HOA's registered agent, Darlene, by certified mail on Friday morning. She was legally required to schedule the meeting within 30 days. The neighborhood app had gone quiet in a telling way. The neighbors who'd commented approvingly on Darlene's community safety post had stopped commenting. Betty Stum, the hot tub neighbor, posted a long, careful, fact-filled account of her own experience with Darlene's amendment tactics. Gerald Foss, the mailbox man, posted a single photograph, his hand-painted mailbox, circa 2009, next to a photo of the cease and desist notice Darlene had sent him. No words, just the two images. The comments under Gerald's post were not kind to Darlene. I went back to my pork chops. They were slightly overdone by then, but some things are worth the sacrifice. Prescott called me on a Tuesday morning, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds of his voice that he'd found something good. Maritime attorneys are not, as a profession, given to dramatic announcements. They prefer understatement, the way surgeons prefer calm. But there was a particular quality to his voice, a compression, like something barely contained. I've been reviewing the HOA's financial disclosures, he said. You're going to want to sit down. I was already sitting. I sat a little straighter. Under the Virginia Property Owners Association Act, HOAs are required to maintain financial records and make them available to members upon written request within 10 days. Clint had made that request 3 weeks ago quietly, formally by certified mail, and the HOA's treasurer, a neighbor named Vaughn, who was starting to understand he'd been a rubber stamp for Darlene, had dutifully complied. The financial records told a story. First, the amendment that gave Darlene authority to pursue storage violations and authorize enforcement actions had been passed at a meeting where only 3 of the 7 board seats were represented. The HOA bylaws required a quorum of 5 board members for any vote on amendments to enforcement procedures. 3 is not 5. The amendment was procedurally void. It had never been valid. Takeaway: HOA amendments passed without proper quorum are legally unenforcement, and any enforcement actions taken under them may expose the board to personal liability. Second, and this was the one that changed everything, Darlene had not paid Ridgeline Recovery out of her personal funds. The HOA's checking account showed a payment of $412 to Ridgeline Recovery towing on the date of the tow. She had used association funds to remove my boat without a valid vote, without proper quorum under a void amendment. That's not a bylaw dispute anymore. That's financial misappropriation of commonly held funds. In Virginia, that opens the door to civil suit, not just against the HOA as an entity, but against Darlene personally as the officer who authorized the expenditure. Prescott used the phrase breach of fiduciary duty in a tone of quiet satisfaction. Third detail, which arrived via a separate channel, the HOA's liability insurance carrier, a company called Sentinel Community Assurance out of Richmond, had been copied on the ombudsman complaint notification as required by the policy. They had opened their own internal review. Their adjuster had already reached out to Vaughn, the treasurer, asking for documentation of the board vote that authorized the tow. There was no documentation because there was no vote. Sentinel's adjuster had also apparently asked Darlene some questions that she found upsetting enough to call Vaughn at 9 o'clock in the evening to complain about. Vaughn told Clint this. Clint told me. I told Prescott. Prescott said she's going to try to settle hard before the special meeting. He was right, but we weren't ready to settle yet. We were ready to build something that couldn't be quietly made to disappear. The special board meeting was 3 weeks out. The JAG officers were scheduled to visit the following week, and I had an idea that had been forming since the day I found that empty patch of grass. An idea about how to make sure that when the public moment came, there were enough witnesses that no version of events except the true one could survive. It was time to stop being reactive and start building the stage. I am not a naturally patient man. The Navy taught me patience the way cold water teaches swimming, through sustained discomfort until it becomes instinct. So the 3 weeks between the midpoint reveal and the special board meeting were not comfortable, but they were productive in the way that the weeks before a mission are productive. Every day building one more piece of a thing that would be, when it mattered, irreversible. I set up at my kitchen table most mornings with a legal pad, a laptop, and whatever was left in the coffee pot. The table had that slightly sticky varnish texture of old furniture that's been cleaned 1,000 times, but never quite fully restored. I'd meant to refinish it for years. I didn't mind it now. It felt like a working surface. Prescott filed 2 things simultaneously. First, a civil complaint in Roanoke County Circuit Court naming Darlene Whitlock individually and the Crestwood Pines HOA as defendants, alleging wrongful towing, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of the Virginia POA Act, and negligent enforcement of a procedurally void amendment. Second, a motion for preliminary injunctive relief, asking the court to order that no further enforcement actions be taken under the void amendment until the lawsuit was resolved. The injunction motion was designed specifically to freeze Darlene in place to make any further harassment a contempt of court issue rather than just another complaint to file. Takeaway: a motion for preliminary injunction can stop an HOA or individual from taking further action against you while a lawsuit is pending. It's a legal pause button, and courts grant them when the plaintiff can show likely irreparable harm. At the kitchen table, I built a damages spreadsheet. This sounds dry. It was actually clarifying in a deeply satisfying way. Line 1, daily storage fee at Ridgeline Recovery, which their own rate sheet priced at $45 per day. I was not paying this. It was their liability. But it was acre-wing as a number that would appear in our demand. Line 2, documented depreciation from improper outdoor commercial storage versus my covered pad. Line 3, lost use of the vessel during prime fall fishing season. I used charter rate comparisons from 2 Roanoke Valley fishing guides as a proxy figure. Line 4, my attorney fees invoiced and itemized. By the time I was done, the number was uncomfortable for a retirement account. Clint organized the neighbor's side. He's the kind of man who makes organizing look like conversation. He'd stop by someone's driveway while they were getting the mail, chat for 10 minutes, and by the end they'd agreed to attend the special meeting and bring their own documentation. He recruited Betty Strom, who brought her original CC&R copy with her amendments highlighted, and Gerald Foss, who showed up with a shoebox of certified mail receipts. Every single notice Darlene had ever sent him, answered, ignored, and catalogued. I reached out to a reporter named Sinclair Pruitt at the Roanoke Valley Examiner, a scrappy local paper that covered county government with the enthusiasm of an outlet that knew it was the last line of accountability between residents and the people making decisions about their lives. Sinclair had covered HOA disputes before and had, he told me, a file on Crestwood Pines that he'd been meaning to revisit. I gave him the ombudsman complaint number, the civil case filing number, and the name of the JA officer handling the vessel inquiry. I told him the special meeting was in 18 days. He said he'd be there. The Navy piece required the most delicate coordination. The JAG lieutenant commander, I'll call her Commander Reyes, a name I've changed slightly for professional courtesy, had planned to conduct her courtesy inquiry at the towing facility and then separately at the towing facility and then separately at the towing facility and then. I asked carefully whether there was any scheduling flexibility. I explained that a formal community meeting was occurring at which the HOA's conduct would be under direct review by members and that the presence of federal officers conducting an inquiry into a vessel connected to that conduct might be in terms of timing, clarifying for everyone involved. Commander Reyes was quiet for a moment. We do have some flexibility, she said on timing. The special board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at 7:00 p.m. in the Crestwood Pines community room. A low ceiling space with fluorescent lights, folding chairs, and the persistent faint smell of stale coffee and carpet cleaner that clings to every community meeting room in America. I knew the room. I'd been to plenty of meetings there. I knew exactly where the front table was. I knew where the door was. I knew where 40 folding chairs could fit. I reserved 40 folding chairs. The civil lawsuit land, like a stone in a still pond, and Darlene's reaction was to try to cap the ripples before anyone noticed how wide they were spreading. She hired an attorney, a local real estate lawyer named Burton, who handled mostly closings and whose experience with HOA litigation was, from what Prescott could tell after reviewing his one previous HOA case, limited. Burton sent Prescott a letter suggesting the lawsuit was premature and that the parties should explore mediation before escalating to litigation. Prescott sent back a polite, dense 14-page response attaching every document. We had the void amendment analysis, the financial records showing HOA funds used for the tow, the ombudsman complaint, the insurance carrier inquiry, and the Coast Guard documentation letter, and suggested that if Burton's client wanted to discuss resolution, they were welcome to reach out. Burton did not respond for 9 days. During those 9 days, Darlene apparently called the owner of Ridgeline Recovery, Dale, and asked him whether any of the towing records really needed to be preserved in their current form. She used language that Dale later described to Prescott's paralegal as asking me to make the paperwork go away. Dale, who by this point had his own attorney and his own DMV complaint to manage, was recording the call. He had learned belatedly about one-party consent. He sent the recording to his attorney. His attorney sent it to Prescott. Prescott sent it to the Roanoke County Commonwealth's attorney's office, with a cover letter politely suggesting they might find it relevant. The word obstruction appeared in the cover letter in a purely descriptive, non-accuracy, educational sort of way. Meanwhile, on the neighborhood app, a new account appeared, username Crestwood, Concerned One, and began posting comments, suggesting that the boat dispute was being driven by a combative and litigious resident, who had a history of intimidating neighbors and had been reported to authorities for threatening behavior. The posts were careful enough to avoid naming me directly, not careful enough to avoid being obvious. Clint, who had worked in commercial electrical systems for 30 years and had a working understanding of how digital metadata behaves, noticed that Crestwood Concerned One had joined the neighborhood app the same week the lawsuit was filed, and that their posting times correlated precisely with times Darlene's car was in her driveway, information visible from the street. He screenshotted everything and timestamped it. Betty Strom delivered the counter-move. Betty was a retired paralegal, a fact I had not known about her until this story, and she understood documentation the way some people understand music, instinctively and with precision. She posted on the neighborhood app under her own name, with her face in the profile photo, a calm and detailed account of her own interaction with Darlene's enforcement tactics. She attached canned copies of her original CCNR page, the grandfather provision, and her certified mail responses to Darlene's notices. She tagged the post with the words "Community Meeting, come get informed." Within 6 hours, the post had 43 comments. 37 were supportive. The remaining 6 were from accounts that had been dormant for months and suddenly had opinions. Clint documented those too. The neighborhood was no longer a passive audience. It had become a participant. People who had never spoken at an HOA meeting were now RSVPing to the special board meeting through a shared Google form Clint had set up. The community room's 40-chair capacity was going to be tested. Darlene, to her credit or her detriment, posted a response under her own name, saying she looked forward to clearing up misconceptions at the meeting and that the board was committed to transparent governance. The irony of that last phrase, delivered by the woman who had towed a boat without a vote, using association funds, achieved a kind of rarefied atmospheric quality. Several neighbors screenshotted it before it could be deleted. She did not delete it, which told me she still thought she could win the room. That was her last significant mistake. In the final week, I went quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of someone who has finished building something and is waiting for the moment to use it. Prescott prepared a bound packet for the meeting. 40 copies, one for every chair we expected to fill, tabbed, indexed, color-coded. It contained the full timeline of events, with dates, the original CC and R storage provision with the grandfather clause highlighted, the void amendment analysis with the quorum deficiency documented, the HOA financial record showing the $412 payment to Ridgeline Recovery, the civil lawsuit filing number and case summary, the DMB complaint status, the OMB Budsman inquiry status, the OMB Budsman inquiry status, and a one-page plain English summary at the front, titled, "What Happened and What It Means." That summary was written for a general audience. Someone who had never read an HOA document in their life could pick it up and understand in 4 minutes exactly what Darlene had done and why it was wrong. Prescott had initially written it in lawyer language. I rewrote it in veteran language. We compromised on something that sounded like a very clear-thinking neighbor explaining something important at a cookout. Commander Reyes called me Wednesday to confirm timing. She and another JAG officer would arrive at the Crestwood Pines community room at approximately 7:30 p.m. on Thursday. Their purpose was to conduct a formal inquiry notification, essentially to deliver written documentation to the HOA president, confirming that a federally documented vessel under their pasture inquiry had been improperly removed from a registered owner's property, and that cooperation with the investigation was expected. This was not an arrest. It was not a raid. It was 2 officers in dress whites arriving at a community meeting, handing a woman a piece of paper and asking her politely, but formally, to explain herself. I explained to Commander Reyes that the meeting was being attended by approximately 40 residents and a local reporter. She noted this without apparent concern. Darlene made one final attempt to stop the meeting. She called the Roanoke County Clerk's office and asked whether the special meeting petition had been properly submitted and whether there were grounds to delay it pending review of the complaint. The clerk's office told her with the bureaucratic serenity of people who have heard every version of this question that the petition met all bylaw requirements and that the meeting was required to proceed as scheduled. She was told this twice by 2 different clerks because she called back. Vaughn, the treasurer, came to my door Thursday afternoon, the first time he'd come to my property in the 11 years I'd lived there. He looked like a man who had been thinking hard about decisions for the past 3 weeks and was not entirely happy with what he'd concluded. He told me he wasn't going to be resigning. He told me he had voted yes on the amendment because Darlene had told him it was a routine administrative update and he hadn't read it carefully. He told me he was going to say that at the meeting. I told him I thought that was a reasonable thing to do. I thanked him. He nodded and walked back across the cul-de-sac. I wrote my statement for the meeting that evening. It was 7 minutes long at my speaking pace. I timed it. It contained no insults, no sarcasm, no raised voice. It contained dates, document references, dollar amounts, and one question that I planned to deliver at the end in the particular tone that my 22 years in the Navy had given me for moments that required absolute clarity. Who authorized the removal of my property using shared funds without a lawful vote? That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the sticky varnished one, my working table, and I looked out the window at the empty concrete pad in the driveway. The floodlight caught the pale rectangle of dead grass at its edge. The scrape in the concrete from the tow truck's equipment was still there. I'd be getting the boat back, but I also wanted something more than the boat. I wanted this to mean something for every person in Crestwood Pines who'd gotten a notice they didn't deserve and felt too small to fight it. I went to bed early, ate a decent meal first, chicken and rice, nothing fancy, the smell of it still in the house when I turned out the light. Tomorrow was going to be a long evening. The Crestwood Pines community room smelled exactly as I knew it would. Old carpet, stale coffee from the percolator. Someone had run 2 hours early. The faint industrial ghost of whatever cleaning product the facility's volunteer used on the folding tables. Fluorescent lights slightly too bright, humming at a frequency just below consciousness. 40 chairs arranged in rows facing the long board table at the front. Every chair was taken before the meeting started. People were standing along the back wall. Darlene arrived at 5 minutes to 7 in a pressed blazer, a stack of folders under one arm, and the body language of someone who had decided that confidence would serve as armor. She took her seat at the center of the board table. Vaughn sat at the treasurer's chair to her left, eyes forward, expression neutral. The 2 remaining board members present, a man named Reed and a woman named Patricia, looked like people who had recently become aware that they were in a autograph they did not want to be in. Sinclair Puett was in the 3rd row with a notepad and a recorder, which he had placed on the seat beside him after asking the person next to him if they minded. I sat in the front row. Clint sat beside me. Bed and Gerald sat directly behind us. Darlene called the meeting to order and immediately attempted to set an agenda that limited public comment to 3 minutes per speaker and specifically described the meeting as a review of community standards procedures, language that softened the actual question on the table. Clint raised his hand and, citing Robert's Rules of Order, which the HOA bylaws explicitly adopted as parliamentary authority, moved that the agenda be amended to include a formal review of the board president's conduct and the specific towing action of September 9th. The motion required a second. Reed gave it quietly, without making eye contact with Darlene. The motion carried 4-1. Darlene's vote was the one. Prescott stood up from the 2nd row. He'd driven up from Norfolk that afternoon, billing hours I was deeply grateful for, and asked permission to present documentation to the board in the community. Permission granted. 40 bound packets went around the room. You could hear the rustle of 40 people opening them simultaneously, the light crackle of tabbed pages turning. Prescott was clear, methodical, and took 20 minutes. He explained the quorum deficiency. He displayed the financial record projected on a laptop screen against the wall showing the $412 HOA payment. He cited the statute, the bylaw, the specific clause. He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. When he finished, Vaughn spoke from the treasurer's chair. His voice was steady, if a little thin. He explained that he had voted for the amendment under the impression it was administrative housekeeping. He stated that he had not been informed of the quorum requirement. He stated that he had not authorized or been consulted on the Ridgeline recovery payment. He stated this clearly in front of 40 neighbors and sat back down. At 7:31 p.m., the community room door opened. Commander Reyes came in first, navy dress whites, gold insignia at the collar, posture that made the room immediately understand it was in the presence of someone official. Her colleague followed. 40 people turned to look. The fluorescent lights caught the brass buttons on their uniforms in a way that was objectively a lot. The room went completely silent. Commander Reyes identified herself, her colleague, and their unit. She stated that they were conducting an inquiry into the unauthorized removal of U.S. East Guard documented vessel documentation number, and she read the number aloud from its registered storage location, and that they had reason to believe the vessel had been removed by action initiated by the Crestwood Pines Homeowners Association. She then placed a formal inquiry notification letter on the board table directly in front of Darlene Whitlock and stated that the association president had been identified as the authorizing party. She asked calmly and professionally whether Miss Sukiation, whether Miss Faherty, Whitlock had anything to say for the record. Darlene opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. What came out was not, as she had probably imagined in her most anxious private moments, a composed denial. It was a fragment, something about routine community maintenance, that drifted off into the fluorescent hum of the room and died there. Reed called for an immediate board vote to suspend Darlene's enforcement authority pending the outcome of the civil lawsuit, the Ombudsman investigation, the DMV complaint, and the Navy inquiry. The vote was 4-1. Darlene voted against it. The room exhaled, and then from somewhere in the back, I never found out who started it. There was applause. Not thunderous, not cruel, just the sustained, genuine, warm clapping of people who had been holding their breath for a long time. Sinclair Pruitt was writing fast. Darlene Whitlock resigned from the Crestwood Pines HOA board 11 days after the special meeting. Her letter of resignation cited personal commitments and health considerations. It made no mention of the civil lawsuit, the insurance investigation, the Navy inquiry, or the 43-page demand letter that Prescott had delivered to Burton the morning after the meeting. Some people make graceful exits. This was not that. It was more like a person leaving a room very quickly and hoping no one mentioned it later. The HOA settled 3 weeks after her resignation. The terms were straightforward. The boat was returned to my driveway at the association's expense, including transport from Ridgeline Recovery's lot. All Acrewing storage liability was resolved between the HOA's insurance carrier and Ridgeline Recovery through a separate agreement. I was not party to that negotiation, but I understand it was not pleasant for either side. My attorney fees were covered. A written apology was included in the settlement. Not one of those non-apology apologies, but a clear factual acknowledgement that the enforcement action of September 9th had been unauthorized, improperly funded, and procedurally void. Ridgeline Recovery reached a separate settlement with the DMV, a civil fine for the notification violation, mandatory staff training on tow notification requirements, and new internal protocols for private property removal requests. Dale, for what it's worth, was not a bad actor. He got played by a client who didn't tell him the full picture. He sent me a brief, sincere email. I don't hold anything against him. The Navy inquiry was formally closed without further action. The vessel's historical connection was real, but thin, as Commander Reyes had originally indicated, and once the boat was returned to its registered owner, the federal interest was satisfied. The inquiry notification letter, however, is permanently filed in the Crestwood Pines HOA's official records, which means every future buyer of a home in Crestwood Pines who does proper due diligence will find it. Some forms of accountability are architectural. The new board, led temporarily by Reed as acting president, with Clint as a newly elected member, spent their first 3 meetings doing what boards are supposed to do, reviewing the CC&Rs clearly, establishing a formal amendment adoption procedure with proper quorum documentation, and creating a resident-accessible summary of all enforcement rules, so no one would ever again receive a notice based on a rule they hadn't been informed existed. The Bertram came home on a Wednesday morning. The tow truck, a different company, not Ridgeline, backed it carefully down my driveway and settled it on the concrete pad with a gentle final clunk of the trailer hitch. I stood there in the same sweats I'd been wearing the morning I found it gone, and I put my hand on the hole. Fiberglass is a strange material. It has no temperature of its own, just reflects whatever's around it. It was cool from the morning air and smooth under my palm, and it smelled faintly of the particular diesel and salt ghost that never fully washes off a working boat. I stood there for a minute. Just that the community benefit was Clint's idea, and I want to say that clearly. Out of the settlement amount, we donated a portion to establish the Crestwood Pines Resident Rights Fund, a small permanent reserve managed by the new board dedicated to covering initial legal consultation costs for any resident who receives an HOA enforcement notice they believe is improper. It's not a war chest. It's a phone call. Sometimes that's all someone needs to understand their rights and find their footing. We also partnered with a local Roanoke area foundation to fund an annual scholarship, $750 per year, for a graduating high school senior interested in studying law, public policy, or civic advocacy. The first recipient was a young woman from Salem, Virginia, who'd written her application essay about watching her family fight a zoning dispute for 3 years. She wanted to be the lawyer on the right side of those fights. That felt like the right place to put the money. As for me, the boat went back in the water the following May. The diesel engine turned over on the 3rd crank, which for an '87 Bertram is practically a standing ovation. I took Clint out first. We caught nothing of particular size, but the weather was good and the coffee was hot, and we sat on the water for 6 hours and barely talked, which is the best kind of fishing. You know what's the most funny? Dawn didn't lose because I applied her. She lost because she never once considered she could lose. $412 from the HOA share account. No board vote, no quorum, just one phone call in the middle of the night from a woman who confused a president title with actual authorities. There are two very different things. When the drug officials walk into that community, rooms dress white go insignia, the kind of portrait you can fake. I didn't feel triumphant. I just feel tired, the specific kind of tired that's come from fighting for something that's never should been taken in the first place. The board came home on a Wednesday morning. I put my hand on the horn and stood there for a minute, didn't say anything to the need to. Here's what I want you to sit with. How many people right now are living inside an HOA and have never once read their CCNR, never knew that a vote without quorum is no vote at all, never knew that a board officer acting alone can be held personal liable, not just the association them personally. Dan Eaton rare, she just the one who got C. If you got your own HOA story ongoing or just getting started, drop it below. I read everyone. His surprise for the next one. A city promise office tried to condemn a perfectly good garage. An 81-years-old veterans decided to risk every municipal code in the county. It did not go well for the permit office. The smallest authority is usually the least accountable. Remember that.